This is Regrid CEO Jerry Paffendorf, and on this episode of Living in the Map, I speak with Giancarlo Gonzalez and Victor Ramirez. Giancarlo is the former CIO of Puerto Rico, author of the book The Digitalization of Puerto Rico, and co-founder of the Urbital real estate app. Victor is a software developer and urbanist based in Puerto Rico and a frequent collaborator with Giancarlo. Let's go right to the videotape. All right. Hey, Giancarlo. Hey, Victor.
Hey, Jerry. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you guys for joining me. I'm excited to talk to you in part because we do know each other to, a greater or lesser degree and have collaborated on stuff over the years. And I was saying, like, one of the fun things about these conversations is I get to talk to my friends a little bit differently. If we were on the phone and I kind of peppered you with all these questions about the history of Puerto Rico and how things got to be the way they are and stuff, you might go, is this an interview or something? But now it's an interview or something. So it's fun. It's appropriate. That's all. So thinking back on that, Giancarlo, I was reflecting about the first time we met each other and the circumstances. I was invited to Puerto Rico in 2017, not too long after Maria, because there was some interest in possibly doing like a island-wide property survey of property conditions along the lines of things that Regrid had worked on in Detroit, and was quickly connected to you and immediately discovered that if you want to learn about tech, data, property information in Puerto Rico, you're probably the best resource that one can find in your connections and knowledge and how personable you are in helping people understand these things. So that's my quick introduction for you and how we got to know each other.
Thank you, Jerry. I appreciate it. If I'm not the best resource, I'm not always the best, but at least I try to surround myself with people that I do consider are the best, and I can certainly point people in the right direction. And I do that often.
And on that note, you're here with Victor today. Do you want to tell me like how you guys work together and how you guys got into various projects here?
Actually, we go way back. Victor and I were in elementary school together for a year. So yep. I've known him for quite some time. Afterwards, when I started working in government in 2013, 14, 15, Victor also worked with a tech company that had a lot of, government background. So he had knowledge of different government systems and was always contributing with government data sets. And I did a lot of work with opening up data inside government, information on potholes, on property information, GIS data. And Victor worked with our civic data team to try to, make information accessible and better. And that's when we started collaborating.
Well, I could go a little bit more specific on that.
How was he in elementary school, Victor? Was he a good person back then, or was that?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
I'm going to say I got an anecdote here. There was a competition on building these little cars with milk cartons.
Yeah.
And you had to like make a little car with a milk carton and then push it off the slope. down the slope. Mm-hmm. And it had to have a sail with a straw and construction paper so that you could also blow when it was in a flat surface.
Yep.
And Victor designed his car with a straw that had the bending so that you could sip it better. And then it allowed for him to put the sail down during the slope so that the wind wouldn't affect it. And then when it was in the flat surface, you would then bring up the sail and blow. And I'll never forget that design, because I was like, his cart is faster than mine. He designed it better with that idea. That was very ingenious. And I never forgot that.
Well, I had a limited understanding of how aerodynamics work, but I was obsessed with it. I was obsessed with aerodynamics, I guess, because it was such a it was such a cool topic for a kid that age back then. And so I incorporated that into the design, and I have some memory of that race. When you mentioned it, I hadn't thought about it, but when you mentioned it a couple of years ago, I was like, yeah, I remember that. That sounds exactly like something I would have done at that age.
I love it. That's hilarious. And Giancarlo, you had the astuteness to go, that's who I want to work with on projects like this over time, on data projects in the future. So
Yeah, I wanted to add that to the story. I had just gotten an audience with the Secretary of Transportation in and using some connections, right? And I was basically he told the bus authority president to give me access to GPS tracking data so that I could perhaps work with the data and process it in some way that it could be open to the public so that people would have access to bus tracking. They would know when the buses would arrive, so they wouldn't have to be waiting at the stop for an indefinite amount of time.
yeah.
And so I had just gotten that, and it just so happened that Giancarlo, when he got that job at government, he was also interested in opening up that data. So that's when we went, oh, I know this guy, Giancarlo. I remember him from elementary school. So we had our first meeting, and it was related to that topic. And unfortunately, that project ended up failing, but that's a whole nother story.
Well, maybe that's a story we can get to, because you guys, I mean, this is fun for me because I feel like, tracks that you both have been on, civic technology, opening up public data to the public, very, very parallel tracks to the journey that the Loveland and Regrid team has been on. And I think that's why we've been kind of fast friends and connectors on stuff, because we've been seeing similar challenges in different places and from different dimensions. And I will mention at this point too, so when you mentioned some of that government experience, so Giancarlo, you were, previously you'd spent some time as the chief information officer for Puerto Rico, and you literally wrote the book on digital transformation for the island. So just to give that background to you, you've seen a lot, both inside and outside. And I don't know about talk about the book here now. It's been out for a few years now, but just to kind of paint a picture of your experiences working with government.
Yeah, the book was a product of the pandemic, really. After I left, so I was in government for 2 years, 2013, 14, 15, about 2.5 years. And after 2015, there was a lot of things that I thought were, left undone. And I had some unfinished business to carry out. And I stayed with it for the next 5 years, blogging, writing about civic tech, looking for opportunities to see where we could perhaps improve services, consulting work. And in the pandemic, when I was locked in, I was thinking, there's going to be an election in November. This was November 2020. We were locked in March 2020. Elections were coming in. We had actually just released, Victor and I, the second version of the bus transportation project, right? Guagua, remember, Victor?
Yeah.
We were releasing the Guagua app in March, and then the pandemic came and they shut down the bus service. So literally our project came to a screeching halt. We were trying to still get access to GPS data then. So that project is shelved. I'm locked in, and I decided, well, I'm going to just write out this idea. There was one candidate for governor that said, hey, if I win, I would bring you back and let you do whatever you think we need to do. And I said, okay, well, if you win, I'm going to write a book. And if you win, I would do what it's going to be in this book.
Yep.
And that's how it started. And funny story, I start writing the book in Spanish. When I'm getting towards the end, a collaborator of us, a supporter of the community, actually, you know him too, Victor, forgetting his name now, but he collaborated with Guagua, the guy that invested also in Guagua and supported our civic project. Forgetting his name now. It'll come to me. But he says, are you doing this in English? And I'm like, no, I wasn't planning on it. He's like, get a quote from a translator to see how much it's going to be in English, and I will send you a check so that you can do the translation. So I got the quote. I went back.
Ryan Grant?
Ryan Grant.
Shout out to Ryan.
Shout out to Ryan. And
Thanks,
Ryan said, get the quote and get back to me. And I'm like, all right, Ryan, here's the quote. I forwarded the quote to him, and he says, I'm wiring No problem. I got that. And that's why we have an English version.
Well, I'll just note too that this resonates with me a lot too, because you're the kind of person who, first off, you are entrepreneurial. You do create your own businesses, and it's your profession, but also very public service oriented, and passionate to the point where you want to put what you want done into words and collaborate with officials to execute plans. And I really admire that. It's no small task to even put together a book. And I think it speaks to kind of a special nature of how enthusiastic and committed you are to this work that you'll do that. Most people don't do that, Giancarlo. It's not a thing you find every day.
I appreciate that. And it's I call it the civic bug, and I can't shake it off. No matter how, I'm focused on Urbital now. It's my new project. It's a real estate app, but within that work, there is civic work in there that I still do and carry out, and we can talk about it further on. But there is still work that I'm doing tied to civic service, and even tied with work that's being carried out at the federal level in collaboration with local agencies here.
So, and I do. So when we were going over notes for this conversation, I kind of gave like a grand long title of Mapping Puerto Rico: History, Business, Policy, Community, and Data. Okay. So just to try to set some goalposts, I know we're going to weave through a number of those things. Like you said, they all come together in the work that you guys both do. You mentioned Urbital as the current business endeavor in the new app that you put out recently. Do you want to talk about that? And we'll kind of segue into other projects.
Yes. So during the pandemic, after releasing the book and then promoting that and working on civic tech opportunities, then came a real estate boom. And I happened to have done real estate work before. And there's something to be said about institutional knowledge or previously acquired knowledge that you have, particularly after having 2 children and a lot of less time committed to your work and having other responsibilities. So going back into real estate work became easier. I have a network of people that I know in the banking, appraisal, real estate sectors. I had built a lot of technology in that industry before. And suddenly going back to that, the challenges that Puerto Rico had with data and information on homes and prices, and being able to do something about it because there is a better infrastructure now with current government systems that provide better data. I ventured into it again, and we built an app. There's no app right now that works in Puerto Rico similar to what Zillow does in the States that can tell you, how much a price estimate on the value of your home, how much homes are selling for in a region. And we're providing that information, but then tying local needs as well. Like if you're searching for homes in the States, you would never think of having a metric that says, how often does power go out in that region? Right? It would maybe never occur to you that, power may be an issue in that neighborhood. But if you are moving to Puerto Rico or buying here, a question that a lot of people are going to ask is, does power go out often there? Because power outages are being common. After Maria destroyed the grid, it's been an uphill battle to restore it to an optimal capacity. And we've been gathering really energy power outage data. Victor worked with me on this as well. We crawled information on public outage data reported by Luma, the energy provider, and then we started trying to relate that to the zones, the neighborhoods, the condominiums where people lived, and trying to then tell you, based on the power outage data, this is how often you are without power.
Well,
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm going to bookmark a question, but no, please.
Okay. I wanted to add some context about the history of, power generation and the economy in Puerto Rico. What happened was in 2006, the Section 936 of the IRS tax code was finally over, right? So Puerto Rico, even before then, Puerto Rico started a process of deindustrialization, and that may that you may be interested in that topic, or that topic may be close to home if you're from Detroit, for example, who's that's part of the Rust Belt, that's seeing deindustrialization, right? So Puerto Rico, because it's an island, right? So it's got an entire self-contained grid, right? So there's the power demand came from a lot of the power demand came from industry, right? So if it deindustrializes, the power demand started going down, and what happened was that there's no new customers, no new demand to pay to reinvest in the infrastructure that we have and new infrastructure. So it was delayed by a couple of years, but what happened immediately was that the power company started not investing because they didn't have suddenly did not have as much money as they had before, or they couldn't project growth. So where are they going to get capital? So they stopped investing. And by the time Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, I mean, there was so much disinvestment in the power grid that it was so vulnerable that it was a catastrophe. Say around 3,000 people died because of mostly because of interruptions in medical care because of power outages.
Actually, adding to that, when I was working as CIO, we built some dashboards, and one of the data points that we had was energy demand, and it was segregated by commercial, industrial, and residential. And we had access to maybe 15 years back of that energy demand. And I remember seeing in 2006, when the 936, these tax credits for pharmaceuticals were phased out in 96, and it was a 10-year phase out. So in 2006 is when many left. You see the drop. It's like a cliff drop of the demand from industrial energy. We saw it, and it was mind-boggling.
Well, let me ask you, because so one thing here, and I know a lot of people are interested in this. I'm personally interested in this and have some senses, but Puerto Rico not being a state but being a territory of the U.S., part connected to the U.S., people have a hard time picturing like what's the same and what's different, right? So when we're talking about real estate, for one thing, and then just like needs for different kinds of data, because you're right. If I look at a house on Zillow in the States, I'm going to take it for granted, I suppose, right? In the case of energy, it's like either it's going to tell me it's off the grid and I get it, it's rustic, or it's going to tell me it's just regular. I love, over the course of this conversation, if you guys could kind of speak to like the differences in some of these things. So like maybe a good place to start is like what is different about real estate and how you get the data to power an app like Urbital versus in the States, and why does the MLS and Zillow not cover things the way that one might sort of assume?
Zillow connects to the MLSs, and when you look at data from the States, Zillow is projecting really MLS data.
Right.
In Puerto Rico, back when the MLS started, let's say in the late 90s, you didn't have problems selling houses. So real estate brokers, many were realtors. You have to be a licensed agent. But let's say you're a licensed agent, you're not a realtor though. You're not paying the membership fee to be a realtor. You cannot use the MLS, but you're a licensed real estate agent. You can sell homes. You can put them on the classifieds in the newspaper, or you can post it online. You can't join the MLS though. So the benefit of joining the MLS is that it has these powerful tools for you to be a better broker. The problem that was happening in the late 90s, early 2000s is that brokers were able to sell homes without the features and benefits that the MLS offered. And when the online classifieds website came out, Clasificados Online, for free, just post your listings here for free, a lot of people used that. It worked. They didn't need to use the MLS. And the MLS only gathered about 20% of the market. Some people did join and became realtors, and they are better brokers because of it. It incentivizes professionalism and better use of data for understanding the industry and pricing, but many didn't, and it just didn't get the mass adoption. And to this day, it still has adoption, but again, it's only about 20% of the market. So if you only use MLS data to power a website, like Zillow uses MLS data, it's limited. It doesn't have the complete picture of what goes on in Puerto Rico. So then there are other data sources. Banks get together to put together all of their appraisal information, and then they create their own database based on mortgage closings, but that doesn't have cash transactions. You have the government's property registry database, which is up to date, but it doesn't have details such as square footage of a home. So even though it has volume in terms of transactions, it doesn't have all the details that you want in a home to do a particular analysis. And then you have, real estate broker collaborated data that may give you some information, but it's a little more scattered. And then if you can aggregate all of this effectively, then maybe you have, the most complete data set out there. And part of the work that we've been doing at Urbital is aggregating as much real estate data as possible, and then trying to relate it, because some of these neighborhoods and regions don't share the same name, or the streets the addresses aren't properly identified. And that's some of the challenges that we've been facing.
Is that so? Is part of the mission there to fill in that missing 80%? Is that a fair way to say it?
No, definitely to provide. Victor?
In fact, now that we're in that topic, is the MLS used in Puerto Rico the same? Are there different MLS systems depending on the state? Is that how it works?
There's about 500 MLS.
So the MLS that they adopted in Puerto Rico is basically a copy of some MLS system that they use in some other state, or it was designed or implemented in house that you remember?
Actually, at some point in 2008, in my previous venture in the real estate space, my platform was used as the default MLS provider, and I would feed realtor.com. Then I sold all of that in 2012, so I kind of exited the industry, and that's when I went to work in government. But when I came back, what they did with the MLS in Puerto Rico, they adopted a service provider that provides MLS services for Florida, mainly Orlando. It's called Stellar. So brokers here subscribe to Stellar. It's the Orlando, Florida MLS service, and that service powers listings in Puerto Rico.
Okay.
It's a solid platform, and you just don't have enough people using it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's ever going to have 100% of brokers using it, just because you don't necessarily need to if you want to sell homes here.
But in general, the question comes out of curiosity, because in general, the way stuff works in Puerto Rico is kind of idiosyncratic compared to perhaps the way that happens in most of the states. Sometimes it truly is idiosyncratic. Like, for example, the law, we use the civil code, Napoleonic civil code of law, whatever. I'm not a lawyer, but I hear this said by many people who know more about this than I do. Which perhaps we have in common. We have that in common with Louisiana, which has the same basis, has the same jurisprudence basis. But a lot of what perhaps people consider idiosyncratic, it's a lot has to do with perhaps the language barrier. Government is conducted in Spanish in Puerto Rico. The law is in Spanish. Many times it's translated, obviously, for the benefit of lots of monolingual English speakers that live in Puerto Rico. I mean, there's a solid minority, but a lot of government happens in Puerto Rico. Government happens in Spanish. Government is done in Spanish, right? So sometimes people are very familiar with the vocabulary, the technical jargon of how to do government things in Spanish, but they don't know what the translation is in English, right? So when somebody who knows, perhaps the states have DMV systems that are They're using the same DMV systems in 3 or 4 states, for example. In Puerto Rico, we cannot adopt a DMV system from another state because mostly because of the language barrier. Perhaps there's some idiosyncrasies, but I'm sure there's idiosyncrasies between the states also. But the difference in language makes it would make the system perhaps very foreign to most people, to the language that most people use.
And actually, to that,
mhm, go ahead.
Go ahead, finish it. I was going to say regarding
I was going to say that perhaps there are some true idiosyncrasies, but maybe a big percentage of those idiosyncrasies has a lot to do with language.
I was going to say that, to what you mentioned, Victor,
Mhm.
there is a National Association of State CIOs, and I was a member of it when I served, and very effective at, streamlining relations between states, because there are idiosyncrasies even between states themselves, and looking to standardize and source better solutions collectively as states. Puerto Rico's membership in that organization it's not as a state, it's as a territory, and we do get the same, we participate and we work together on solutions, but I always had even a larger barrier than many of the states in finding and sourcing some of the solutions. Now, there is a good point to say, and I think Victor did some work with this. We do have probably the best DMV solution. I would throw it out there against any other state.
Okay.
We have an app that has 2 million users. You have your digital driver's license there. We had the vaccination ID system there. You can pay fines, renew your license, sell your car through this DMV app. And it's actually great work that the people from the tech community were able to to win that contract and deliver something of major value to every single citizen in Puerto Rico. And I think Victor worked on that.
I worked a little bit on that, but not. I wasn't part of the core team. I was just helping out a little bit with some extra time with that company. I did work with the DMV system, but full time, but a long time ago. This was from around 2006 to 2009. So, back then, I guess the DMV system was basically controlled by one consulting company that I happened to work with, and so progress was kind of slow. That company was kind of happy with their current situation, I guess. I don't know. Maybe that's not the perfect way to describe it, but it really started moving along. The progress really started happening in around was it around 2018? I believe.
Yeah, 2017.
Yeah,
2018.
2018, when the Puerto Rico Digital Service Office started, which was basically what Giancarlo. One of the big things that Giancarlo was promoting to
creating the office by law. So it's in the book.
Tell us more about that. Tell us more, because I was going to ask you for some more stories about public data efforts that you guys have both worked on, and how those get used in other projects that you've done, and how other people are using that data. But that sounds like a great gateway. Tell people about the digital department.
So you want to, if you, at least my view, and it's not shared by many that will go work in government, but at least the way that I approach my work in government is that I'm going to try to look at world-class solutions, world-class teams, and I'm going to emulate that here, because I'm going to do something that's world-class. Mm-hmm. And looking at that, the world-class organization, at that time, 2013, 14, people talked about the government digital service in the UK, led by Mike Bracken and Tom Loosemore. It was considered, one of the first, Estonia being another, user-centric, digital first driven entities that was transforming how government delivers services. And they kind of became the grandfathers of what Obama then created when the Obamacare website failed, and you're familiar with this. We've both been to Code for America, and they had to rescue healthcare.gov. And Code for America had fellows in Puerto Rico. I applied to that program. We worked together with the team that Jennifer Polka had built to serve as fellows in different cities, and Puerto Rico was one of these recipients. And as we worked together, you saw the trend of establishing the U.S. Digital Service and 18F at the Government Services Agency, and assembling a team of engineers that could go into a specific agency and help with designing what needed to be done before contracting it out, maybe building some things in-house. If it's essential to the mission, build it, don't outsource it, build a team in-house. And that was all happening as I was serving as CIO. So I was looking at these best practices and saying, okay, so we need to establish an office here also and adopt these same standards and policies. And following that trend, what I wrote in the book essentially is the structure for how to get this done. And probably the thing that I'm proud of the most that's in that book that I haven't seen in many places yet is that I recommend a digital commission at the state legislature that works hand in hand with the executive side. So anytime a bill is presented, you have it at the appropriations committee, at the infrastructure committee, whichever committee, but there's no digital committee. There's no committee with digital experts that can, provide these lawmakers with advice on proper design standards. That they're writing these legislations with things that are going to be hard-coded into a solution, and you haven't really validated any of that. And that part of the book is the one that we're probably still lacking on the most.
Okay.
But on the other hand, the entity to the PRITS, the digital structure, was created, and there is a team there, and that team was able to, find an appropriate company to work on projects such as Cisco Digital, and that's why you have the result that we have with our DMV app.
Yeah, it used to be. The thing is that the office of the CIO used to be subordinate to the Office of Budget and Management. That's why, just to give you some context, right? Yes. So Giancarlo's recommendation, and it happened after his tenure as CIO, was to separate that part of the business from the Office of Budget and Management into its own thing. And but not only that, there's obviously a lot more in his proposal, but just to give you some context.
That's great, and I'm curious because we've collaborated over time on how do we get and assemble digital property data from counties around the U.S. How can we do a better job getting at digital property and real estate parcel data in Puerto Rico? I would love for you tell me what's the best way to start on here. Like, it could be interesting to hear how Urbital, for example, makes use of public record data to put into an app that people use for better, easier real estate purchasing. But what data sources are you pulling from, and how does digital land record data in Puerto Rico kind of work generally? I know it's a big kind of topic to unpack, but just kind of getting into like, what is available right now, and how do you use it, and what are you trying to crack open next?
We pull from a lot of data sources. Two of the main ones that are important, the Cadastro Digital, so the parcel data map that is open, which you feed off of it with Regrid, and also the property registry. But before that, there were efforts. I think Victor worked on the OpenStreetMaps effort. You yourself were involved with civic efforts to try to improve data, and maybe you can talk a bit about that first.
Yeah, well, I was involved with OpenStreetMap. There's this fellow from St. Louis, Missouri, who first, I don't know why, he was a digital nomad, and he came down to Puerto Rico. He was involved in the OpenStreetMap humanitarian effort. I don't know if you've heard of it, HOT.
Yep.
HOT project.
One of our colleagues, Blake, a key member of our data team, came to the team from working on HOT. So yeah, well familiar with the great work that they do.
Yeah. So he came to live in Puerto Rico for some strange reason. I can't remember why he came down here, but he contacted me and another friend, and he said, let's start doing map events. And the first event, it was just us three. And I said, all right, well, let's do another one. And we started mapping the buildings in Old San Juan and the businesses. We started with Old San Juan, thinking that it's a tourist hotspot. We'll start from there. And we did a couple of mapping events. And after that, we started looking into government sources so we could import data into OpenStreetMap. And so I started getting more familiar with government sources for stuff like that, like buildings and addresses and all that stuff. And then when Maria hit, I talked to some of the HOT people, and they said, hey, they asked me, hey, do you want to activate the HOT horde, because that's what they call it.
Mhm.
The horde and they get a bunch of students to do mapping events all over the United States, or to help out a place that's been afflicted by a particular catastrophe. And this was really important in the Haiti earthquake, right? So Port-au-Prince the buildings are pretty well mapped, thanks in part to that effort. And the same thing happened in Puerto Rico after Maria struck. They did a bunch of mapping events in universities all over the states, and that's why right now we have a pretty good building source of building footprint geometries for all of Puerto Rico.
Yep.
So after that, I guess I have a 3-year-old son. So when my son was born, we stopped having free time.
Now you get me.
Yeah, we stopped having a lot of free time, and but so
I guess an extension
I guess I've delegated my work in OpenStreetMap to the newer folks.
Well, some
could
it's
say
legacy, the milk box racer, right? You got to pass it on to your son. He's got to build the next fastest milk box
Yes.
racer now. So.
I guess you could say, though, that an extension of that work is what we're now trying to see if Jerry's group can supply with the
Well, that was what we
building data,
discussed,
right? Doesn't that kind of go together with what you?
And we'll see if that's a fit. But I just love. I mean, you think about the different ways to generate data and where it comes from. So my understanding with the OpenStreetMap approach is you get the latest and greatest aerial imagery that you can, for example, and then you essentially sit down and you're manually tracing it, or digitally
Mhm.
tracing it, but putting the points on the corners. We have a partner called Earth Define who uses machine learning applied to aerial imagery across the states and territories, and uses algorithms to like automatically identify the buildings and separate out the swimming pools and the tennis courts and the stuff that kind of look like buildings. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's useful in your guys' context, but I love just these different approaches that can take place. And I'm not sure. I would guess the aerial imagery machine learning is probably more current at this point, but there may be other qualities to the hand drawn. So, just an interesting challenge in keeping that stuff all current. So.
Plus, I guess the building data that was built through the OpenStreetMap effort is always valid because it's got a free license. That's unlike
Yep.
Unlike perhaps the LiDAR data that is in Regrid, which is obviously more up to date and extremely useful. Nevertheless, there's some limitations on what you can do with it because of it's probably got a proprietary license, which is it's understandable. It's a business.
Nope. And that's it's so interesting. That's why it's so important to have these public and accessible sources. I think that's probably something that we all try to figure out a balance on too. So like you mentioned, in the case of Regrid data, I mean, like what the main product, the nationwide parcel data that we assemble comes from public record sources and inputs. And then when you actually get these sources, it's like they're there and available, but they're messy as heck. They're not standardized. They're updated at different times. And so there's like a job of like actually making it legible, clean, easy to use, and the same everywhere, plus adding additional data fields and inputs to it. But you can't do the work without the foundational digitized public record data, right? And I think that's a common theme to like all the work we do is like you need to improve the government digital services and the amount of transparency to the data. And then from there, it's not the end of the story. You got to build on it and turn it into things that are easy for people to use and that produce insights. So yeah, it's
Right.
one big stack. I don't know, the commercial down to the public, and it all needs to be nurtured and watered and all that.
Governments can provide those underlying data platforms, and then as the better they are, the more innovation that can come out of them.
Not only that, basically, the government data has to be, it has its, I mean, the businesses around government data have their place, obviously, but government data, the quality of government data sets basically a minimum standard where businesses have to go above and beyond in order to be a viable business, in order to sell something of value, right? So if your government data gets better, then commercial data has to go above and beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Yep, I do. It's like the value always needs to constantly be moving up the chain, as it should be, right?
And what can happen is that those that live off the current state don't necessarily want the government to improve, because they'll say, oh, wait, that would kill my business. No, don't do anything about that. And maybe they have some influence and power with a local legislature, and they prevent the innovation from happening. And
is that a challenge that you've seen in Puerto Rico? I know this can be kind of sensitive to talk about too. Are you definitely?
No, I mean, when I was CIO, I know that I may have been doing things that would have taken some people out of business. But if their product is not up to standards, or adapt or die, that's just it's to what Victor said: raise your game, be better.
So I hear, because I do think that there's risks and there's horror stories that can happen. The issue to me is when the private vendor becomes essentially the monopoly, and it mercifully I think it's fairly rare. I can only think of like a case or two in like North America where something comes to mind where it's like, someone got the contract to provide all public record information for a hefty fee and was really playing that kind of gatekeeper.
I think there's a lot of examples. I mean, you could look at, for example, NOAA has a lot of weather data, and companies like AccuWeather connect to that, and then they use it. But they don't necessarily want NOAA to innovate and offer apps. It's documented in Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk. He talks about that one example, and there's a lot of them where there's private sector people benefiting off of this information, even government GPS.
That's fair. I guess I was thinking about it from the perspective of like nobody else could get at that source data, not from the government, not improving. But no, I hear you on that level. Yeah. Well, let me
this day import. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Giancarlo. I'm trying to think. I've got a number of notes here and questions I want to get into, but keep going.
So something that we had mentioned before and worth mentioning. To this day, Puerto Rico doesn't have an app with accurate bus transit information, real-time data on when is the next bus going to arrive. We basically reset back to zero again with the government supplier not delivering an appropriate system, with the GPS being out there, and they're not able to then provide it to third parties to do that service. So at the end of the day, who's impacted the most? The user that needs the service. 167 plus cities all over the world have apps with real-time information on bus routes. Puerto Rico is not one of them.
What so kind of thinking about, so we talked around like the civic tech scene and kind of the open data sort of scene, but I'm curious to hear from you, like what is the current lay of the land as far as like tech community, open data community, like how would you estimate like the size and the current energy? Like who are the networks you would point people towards to like learn more or connect with? What's the temperature like?
We're so out of the game with kids and family, right, Victor?
Yeah.
But there are still events. There's definitely, great event spaces doing innovation. I would mention, for example, Engine 4 in Bayamón with the mayor of Bayamón, Ramon Luis. He supports this entity that's doing a lot of innovative work there. We have co-working spaces in Puerto Rico, Piloto 151, that we host, events such as the Indie Hackers Meetup, and people get together to talk about projects. There's a new coding school, coding academy for university students that don't necessarily want to go for the degree, but they just want to learn skill sets in software development, and they can join this school. And it's actually in the same corridor where there's a lot of new tech companies there. A lot of investment is happening in this specific strip in Santurce, and you can see that there's a community and that there's an ecosystem there. You have accelerator programs like Parallel 18 and Rising Entrepreneurs in Mayagüez. It's definitely a long way. It's come a long way from 2013 to 2023 in the last 10 years. There's still a lot of work to be done, but the ecosystem is definitely much more diverse, robust. There's a couple of startups that have raised capital from international investors like SoftBank, one of them being Raincoat. It's a parametric insurance services provider. So they provide, a lump sum to any policy owner if certain weather conditions were met above his home. And that's a very interesting project. It runs on blockchain technology. There's a couple of other.
That one uses uses very concrete metrics in order to do automated payouts. Like for example, if a hurricane passes within a mile from your house, the eye of the hurricane passes from within a mile of your house, it reads that public data and it automatically produces payouts for the people that are affected, right? It's a smaller policy. I think it was $10,000, $5,000 or $10,000, but the payouts are immediate.
And that would be an example. I mean, that sounds to me really homegrown. Connect me if I'm wrong on this. Not just the sense that it's based and headquartered in Puerto Rico, but that's responding to local
needs. Yeah, absolutely.
Local needs. Absolutely. But interesting enough, though, the company has sold more policies in LATAM than in Puerto Rico. So it's actually, it launched here and it's running out of here, but it's doing really well globally.
Which is great. So they've decided to expand outside of the island, and
that's what.
Yeah,
an export-based economy from innovation-driven enterprises, to me, is the roadmap for a prosper, better Puerto Rico. There's no other way to create value than doing that.
And you're getting me to think too, because I feel like I love when projects have unique local influences. I'll even for a second I'll talk about the work that Regrid does now nationally, just being so heavily influenced by Detroit, where it was like there were so many property complications and challenges that it created this passion to go like, this information really needs to be accessible to people, so that government, yes, but also block clubs, neighborhood groups, nonprofits, foundations, private activators, motivated collections of people can understand who owns what needs to be repaired, what public land is available for parks and gardens and food and new development, like etc. And it was like, you wouldn't necessarily expect something like what we're doing to come out of Detroit and go nationally, but like having been there and having like surfed those influences, it was like, obviously this is sort of like, if you like this somewhere else, this is sort of Detroit's gift to you, in a sense, because like we learned this from navigating local things. And on that level, like, I mean, it's, I look at the things that you're doing uniquely, whether it's in Urbital and you're looking at incorporating energy and energy fluctuations and energy outages. Can you maybe speak a little bit to, I don't know, some of these unique things on the island that you're surfing? Because there's a lot going on. I mean, you talked about deindustrialization, but I mean, you know, having been to Puerto Rico, you know, a number of times now, it's like you find an interesting mix of environments. I mean, it's like, you know, urban life and business and culture on, like, I'll go ahead and call it world class, to use your, you know, your terminology from earlier, right? As well as finding, like, um, you know, housing that might be, you know, considered substandard, from, like, maybe it wasn't built up to code, or it's older, or it's, you know, it's still damaged. As well as some of the unique ecological concerns, coastlines, rainforests, just pristine kind of land. And I'm just wondering, like, I don't know, it's kind of a basket of questions in one question, but, like, what unique influences are you guys finding just on, like, on the island's terms, apart from trying to open up more data, and like, what are, like, some of the really compelling things that you're like, what I think makes it exciting to build this stuff in Puerto Rico is this, because we wouldn't get these kind of influences anywhere else, or we wouldn't see the same kind of challenge the same way somewhere else.
I think that Puerto Rico makes things so hard. You know, it's very challenging here. And by the way, shout out to you. You took part in a brigade to
Yep.
go install solar panels after the storm. You were part of the off-grid relief initiative. I remember I actually bailed at the last minute. I had that situation to take care of, but you and Andy
I,
went to put some solar
I,
panels.
I appreciate that. I will also make a full confession that we were a very small part of, you know, somebody else did the funding. We went out and helped support. But thank you for that. No, we went out and you know, gotten to see, I don't want to say a lot of the island, but, you know, all four corners, or six if you count the middle, you know, have kind of been around. And I do want to bookmark something there too, because that was related to that blockchain conference that was happening in Puerto Rico. And I'm curious, you mentioned one thing about blockchain. I'm kind of curious how that community is kind of playing out in Puerto Rico, because I know that there was almost like a flock of crypto entrepreneurs and blockchain folks. I'm not sure, you know,
Big community. I haven't I haven't been too involved with it in the last couple of years. But it's, you know, it's there. They do have their meetups. They're working on different projects. There is a group doing a lot of work with energy and building, you know, decentralized energy grid services provider. And one guy in particular, forgetting his name now, but doing work in that space. And there's a lot of movement going on with solar panels and you know, other forms of energy. That work, the energy work, really took off for us when we started sourcing that Luma power outage data. And at the federal level, it was Denise Ross, President Biden's chief data scientist, who reached out, as well as the Secretary of Energy, Granholm. She has been very attentive to Puerto Rico's needs, but Denise in particular told me about the outage data initiative that's looking to standardize how power companies provide power outage information to provide, you know, better reporting across the US. And through her request, we were able to connect ODI with Luma, the local energy services provider, after having reported, you know, the power outage data that we gathered that had a lot of different inaccuracies. And to my surprise, like, Luma signed on as to join the outage data initiative, and they're on a roadmap to improve how they're going to provide their power outage information. It's scheduled to be releasing something, I think, by the summer. And that's part of the impact that you look to have, right? Puerto Rico it's hard to get things done here. We started a podcast where we talk about the topics that bother us every day that we think could be improved, and we don't stop at suggesting improvements. We'll go out and execute and take it as far as we can, and that goes with, you know, energy, mobility, having better walkability in a region, improving, you know, pedestrian centered
Access.
neighborhoods and access, and that's where the focus has been. And really, I never thought about any of this until Victor really hammered the urban mobility concept in me, and I read this book called Confessions of a Recovering Engineer.
Oh,
and
was
it
that the
just
Strong Towns book? Was that?
yes,
Yeah.
that book has transformed my thinking.
I gotta say, I'm gonna pause for 1 second here, because even in the last like 2 minutes of like some of the names and things that you mentioned, I'm feeling a lot of like dots suddenly connecting. So we know Denise Ross back from when she like led the GIS department in New Orleans. We had,
After Katrina, that's why she
yeah,
connects so much with Puerto Rico. We went through it as well.
yeah. So these connections, right? So and we had a, you know, kind of a connection there with New Orleans, again because of Detroit has similar there are similar challenges, different exacerbating factors, some similar factors, less weather, but similar similar needs and challenges. And so we connected with her when we were trying to get parcel data for New Orleans, and she was really helpful on that front. She has some great talks that she's given where she's kind of talked about, like, if I'm remembering this right, kind of like parcel files were kind of like trading like Grateful Dead tapes back in the day. It was like, it was hard to get from the government directly, but it was like people were kind of trading these files around. And that reminds me too. I remember after Maria, we were kind of shocked that we did have like U.S. Army Corps of Engineering and I think somebody from like New York governor's office, like kind of coming to Regrid asking us for, parcel data for Puerto Rico. And so whatever, Denise is, understands these issues, and it's great. One of the two last people that I talked to for this podcast, one was a video game developer made a game called Norco, which is kind of a GIS inspired video game. And worked with us in the GIS department of New Orleans. And then the very last person that I interviewed is a guy named Robert Ferry, has a program called Landar Generator. And it's all about inviting artists and architects to collaborate on renewable energy systems that are production scale, but also very beautiful. So sort of like, invite people into getting excited about renewable energy systems, solar, wind, how they can fit into communities. And to bring it back home, you mentioned energy on the island a few times right now. I mean, that stands out to me as an example where, like, I wouldn't be surprised to see innovation around that challenge in Puerto Rico come up with things that other people start to use. I can't speak to it because I don't know the scene, but that seems like there's such a ripeness there, right? Where it's like something gets figured out locally that works for people that would be appreciated elsewhere, but nobody really had the immediate motivation to do it. So that stands out, at least to me, from a semi-distance, as something where it's like, that's like a space to watch in Puerto Rico, to see what solutions get developed to fill in for the power companies' traditional challenges.
To quote Denise, she mentioned once, parcel data is the principal unit of recovery. So if we can relate that data point to the energy service provider, the property registry, it would provide for, more timely disaggregated data that can, provide for, equitable response and recovery for future disasters.
The oh gosh, I'm trying to think. So, and you also mentioned Chuck from Strong Towns. So you want to talk about how that kind of is influencing you at all? It's just a great network. I've had some colleagues that have been on their podcast.
I think Victor can elaborate better on that with his mission on the land value tax.
well, around 2000, right? So I graduated college in 2002, and I had a girlfriend, and she moved to New York. We agreed to split ways because I was gonna go back home, and she was gonna go to New York. But still, I visited her the first time I go to New York, and I got on the subway system, and I found that the subway, I found it extremely liberating, using public transportation, not having to depend on a car. And I thought, and that's the first time that I thought that I had like a religious experience. Wow, this is great. Everybody should have public transportation. What the hell is going on? Right. So after that, I studied urban planning at the University of Puerto Rico in the
That's what
2000s.
drove you to go do your master's in urban planning. You didn't
Yeah.
study urban planning initially. Okay.
No. I'm a software engineer. I
know.
studied at University of Florida in Gainesville. Go Gators. So so I studied. I got this really intense curiosity in learning about urban planning and public transportation, and I just got hooked. And obviously, when I had that religious experience, that's the only thing that I would ever talk about, right? So I was not the best guy to talk with at parties, but still, but I still have that passion for public transportation, walkable places, and I still read up on the topics and see what's new under the sun. So a couple years ago, I've been following the Strong Towns for a couple of years, and around 2015, I got another religious experience. Is it I understood what was going on in terms of economics, right? So public transportation is an extremely useful service. It can create a lot of value, right? So it creates places like not only large cities like New York City, but urban places that are the places that you go visit when you go on vacation, when it's not a beach vacation or a resort vacation. In fact, well, actually, when you go to something like Walt Disney World, you go to downtown Disney, it's an idealized urban environment without, for example, cars, and everybody loves visiting that because it's pedestrian, everything's pretty, and everybody loves going to Europe, which has got these beautiful cities that are way above in terms of aesthetics and pleasantness compared to the cities in the United States, right? So I understood what the economic rules underlying this are about. And the thing is that something like public transportation creates a lot of value for the properties that are around it. But the government agencies that create the public transportation, they only get revenue from the fare box, right? So in order to, you can measure the value that this public transportation creates by measuring the value of the land in the properties around, for example, a public transit station. So in theory, the government can just can basically create a feedback loop where it creates a revenue stream from this indirect value that it's creating by using a special kind of property tax, which is based on the value of the land and not on the value of the building, right? Because buildings depreciate, but over time, land tends to appreciate because of government services. So this concept is called land value capture. And how does this relate to why public transit doesn't happen a lot in cities in the United States? Because traditionally it hasn't been using this sort of land value capture for the services that it provides. So not only that, which the lack of a property tax on the value of land makes it very cheap for property owners in these places, in the areas of influence of public transit, to leave empty lots or parking lots where it would be much more useful to get built up, to densify around the public transit stations.
This is an idea. It feels so. I became a sort of property tax expert in Detroit just because one of the issues that got us really out of our chairs and motivated was this gigantic tax foreclosure problem. So many
Mhm.
people were losing their homes and property to tax foreclosure, the penalties and the fees and the interest. And so really went down the rabbit hole of understanding that issue, recommending policy changes, doing direct outreach to the treasurer's office, to people who were struggling personally without being able to pay these bills. And I know that some of the bigger picture policy ideas around this, like, that's what was my introduction to like ideas like the land value tax, and this notion that like when you tax the development on the parcel more than the land, you're also, like you just said, you're disincentivizing people to actually develop housing and
Exactly.
businesses and things of this nature. Um, what's the attitude or the appetite in Puerto Rico for experimenting in that direction? Because I do see, I've heard rumblings that Detroit is interested in experimenting in that direction. It feels like there's a mood, probably driven in large part by networks like Strong Towns, to really like socialize this idea. I use socialize in the sense of getting it out to people and have it be talked about. Is there a local appetite for that? Because it is an exciting thing to think about the impacts of.
Well, I haven't seen a lot of appetite. I mean, Giancarlo and myself are are basically we're talking about it. Let's just say we're talking about it. There's also, I would say that there's some rumblings in the legislature. Like they seem to, some people understand that something needs to be done about the property tax in Puerto Rico. But
If the
I don't.
legislation was poorly designed, it would have created a major backlog.
Well, but I'm not talking about this. I'm not talking about a specific legislation project of a specific bill that happened last year. I'm just saying that the general climate seems like there's perhaps some people see that there's some issues with the property tax and that it
I
needs to
agree.
be
I guess
improved.
what I'm saying is that if we're not
Mhm.
effective with whatever is done, and it comes out as part of a policy that's not designed appropriately, then it's going to get a lot of backlash, and then it will kill whatever movement we may have. There's certainly rumblings and things are happening. It would be It's essential that if something were to advance in that space, that it has the proper guidance in place and it's communicated effectively.
I just I guess that what I would want more people to know is that, okay, there's been some statistics thrown out in the press. They're talking about 300,000 homes that are abandoned or not
Or
used,
blight, blight, yeah,
blighted,
blight
or
home.
let's just say abandoned, unoccupied, right? And the message that I would want people to know is that you can prevent that with a properly crafted property tax. You can help prevent that's things from happening. The other statistic that I found that was extremely interesting was that um, just taken from the census data,
Yeah.
when you look at um, the house price index, the is a median house price. That's a statistic in the American Community Survey that they publish every year. Median house price, and then you look at median wages. When you normalize house price to wages, what you get is that in Puerto Rico, housing is twice as expensive as it is if you take the entire United States, right? So obviously there's places where housing is more expensive than in Puerto Rico. California comes to mind in general, but in general, housing in Puerto Rico is high up there. It's very high compared to what people make.
What cost,
So
or what's the contribution? Is it people from outside of Puerto Rico purchasing homes and property with different levels of income, or is it that people just generally spend a greater percentage of their income on housing?
I would say that we just need more housing, that we've had a chronic housing shortage. That's my take on it. I guess that there's a factor from outside people, people that don't live in Puerto Rico, buying some homes or whatever. And then there's this acute issue that's been causing a lot of noise in the
The
papers, which is
gentrification from the
the
Act
jet.
22
Yeah,
people. And
Yeah,
and to that point, Victor mentioned something important.
The Airbnb stuff, like people are backlashing against Airbnb because some people are taking homes and converting them into Airbnbs. But and sorry, Giancarlo, I'll let you speak in a second. But an important thing is that there's also right next to a lot of these Airbnbs, you'll have empty lots, right? So there's I mean, technically there could be space for everything, for Airbnbs and for lots and lots of more housing, right? But we have a chronic housing shortage, and it's not necessarily in places where people stay for Airbnbs in Airbnbs. I mean, the housing issue is a problem unto itself.
And a lot of it can be dated back to the crash in 2008. A lot of people were underwater. A lot of people are still underwater in their mortgages today in places in the metro area like Guaynabo. You can still have an apartment unit that you bought that its prices today are not what they were back in 2008. There are specific pockets and regions that are definitely much higher, and that had to do with the influx of people moving over because of the tax decrees. But some people on the far left are pushing for eliminate this tax incentive, and whatever little economic activity is being created on the island by this specific law, just getting rid of it from overnight wouldn't help the economic progress. Victor mentioned something much better. You would fix the blight, the properties that are abandoned, by having a better tax structure on homes, like a land value tax. So solving problems at the root is what we need, not complaining and going against a particular group of people moving to Puerto Rico because of tax structures and blaming them for the problem. It's very similar to what people in the States do when they blame immigrants coming in. There's some of that also happening here with that. And we need to look at the root cause of the problem. And I think it's what Victor mentioned on.
When you mentioned a number a little bit ago, the 300,000 estimate for houses, was that the estimate for vacant and blighted houses, or did I mishear?
Yeah,
Let's
300,000.
Yeah, and just to put that number in context, we're talking about the digital cadastre has about 1.5 million properties on record, right? Something around that. So 300,000 is a big chunk. It's 20%, and that also coincides. That number is also the same number that's given by the census in vacant properties. It's 20% of housing units are vacant according to the American Community Survey of the Census.
Yep. And that's we could have an hour conversation together about that too, just because that is you all know that's actually how we first got to meet each other, was this notion of like, hey, these people have done a similar kind of accounting of vacancy and building conditions in Detroit, and that's my head has not been there like in a minute, that kind of work specifically, but I'm curious, like what are the current programs that are happening that are set up to address the vacant properties? Is there any like major initiative or program right now, be it demolition or rehab or?
No, and
that's
the
where
problem,
we're failing the most. And
the problem is exacerbated because of you have so much out migration from the island, right? So since there's so much out migration, the succession, the owners of the property, they eventually die. Their children, the successors, are all in the States, and they don't want to deal with it. And and I guess that's why I try to emphasize so much that the property tax and basically that the property tax agency, which is a central agency, they should be doing more work to deal with this issue, right? Because Housing is extremely expensive, and there's a lot of abandoned houses, and they're not doing what they should be doing about it. According to the press recently, on paper, this is not recoverable debt, but on paper, the property tax agency has $4 billion in tax delinquency.
Yep.
And
That's
the general fund budget of Puerto Rico is $10 billion. It's around $10 billion. So
yep. And I would not recommend this per se, because we saw the challenges in Detroit. But I mean, one interesting thing is, and this is concern about, forage can be too hot and too cold. One of the things that took place in Detroit is that there's a big out migration from the city, right? So 2 million people at its peak in 1950, and now about 600,000, right? So
Wow.
you're down to like you're scraping a third, right there. And when people leave, they didn't take the properties with them. There was a long delinquent tax lien process where you didn't pay your property taxes. Somebody come and buy the lien. I'll get this wrong. There's some years it can really kind of kick a can down a road where the house is just kind of sitting there vacant and nobody can work on it. So the solution in Michigan was like, let's speed that process the heck up. So like after 2 years of not paying taxes, you're going to get a warning that your property's been forfeited. And at the end of the third year, we're just going to auction it to whomever. And the assumption, we got to do
Dame un
yes.
segundito. Olga, dame un segundito que estoy acabando algo.
No, I know the property taxes get everybody excited. So now we got family members coming in that want to the but what happened in that case is that there was an assumption that if you foreclosed quickly, property values were always going to rise. You would find a way to pay your taxes. And what happened in reality is that homeowner occupants just got buried under this debt, got confused. And we saw, in a period of like 6 or 7 years, more than 50,000 occupied homes are right in that range. Owners and renters just get their stuff sold over the internet.
A problem that we're having here, actually, because homes are being declared blight, and
public
they
nuisance.
are using it, public nuisance, and the mayors are using that to try to find sweet deals to buy up and scoop up, and there's a whole report out there now about that. So it's
So
it's a
certainly,
problem, and it
yeah,
needs to
certainly
be-
it's a very important thing to consider but I guess that we're on the other extreme here, where
Yeah, well,
tax delinquency is not being handled, as in
not handled.
eventually some properties need to get auctioned.
Yeah, no,
Mhm.
and how do you do this with efficiency, uniformity, but also empathy and carving out some special categories? You're giving me like flashbacks that like I've tried to push away from some of this stuff over time, but it's almost like, how do you get enough data and enough personal connection to know, for example, hey, this property that's behind on its taxes, and maybe it's, who knows, 7 years, 10 years, who knows? I'm not sure how long these things go back, right? But like, very in debt, is actually occupied by the owner who's been there for a very long time and intends to stay, versus a property where it's like, this owner doesn't even live on the island, has not really ever been here, and is, through their absence, creating this nuisance where it's not going to have a detrimental effect to a home occupant if it were foreclosed. Very, very tough to tease apart, because in my mind, they do call for different kinds of interventions or actions, right?
Well, right now in the current system, like for example, a pensioner that's behind on their property taxes could apply for a payment plan, right? So they get they get a payment plan. And if you're kicking people out of their homes, you're doing it wrong. Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. And I don't know, coming from a programming background, I figure that at least in the technical level, it should not be hard to find out who um, is not consuming any electricity and who is not consuming water. I mean, not who, as in which properties are not consuming, basic utilities.
Yep.
At a technical level, it should not be that hard to determine that in order to find out which properties are certainly abandoned.
When we did the Motor City Mapping Project, the big citywide blight and vacancy survey, there was a vacancy index that was created for that project, and it was essentially a 4-point index. And there was 1 point if the water was off, 1 point if the electricity was off, 1 point if it wasn't receiving mail, and 1 point if the in-person canvasser also identified it as clearly vacant. And it created this kind of spread where if it was a 4, it was like almost certainly vacant. We did find some cases where people were living in them, but it was not an ideal situation. Probably the person, not to make a value judgment, but the rehousing may be preferable because it was not, safe enough to code. But those are the inputs for comparison. Like that's what was able to come together working with the local power company. And
Under what agency was this? There seems to be, there was a structure here, like a task force working on this. I mean,
it was the task force. Yep. So this was, and I'll try to get this all right because it's strange. This was 2013-14. So it's a minute ago now, but there was a task force. It did have White House support. So this was the Obama administration went, and behind the scenes, I don't know what support, fully meant, but there were definitely people and professionals and kind of attention paid here. And then it was public-private partnerships, Quicken Loans, now Rocket as like the main sort of corporate sponsor and a funder, and then local foundations. And the city worked with them as a partner. So it was a public-private partnership under a task force to do this work.
I would look at that model and see if something like that could be applied here. That would be a good starting point because we don't have anything. I don't think there's anything here that's structured that way. Victor, do you know?
No, not at all.
No.
There would need to be some sort of mandate that, look, power company Luma, give us this data. The water company, the waterworks company, give us this data so we can cross match it.
Well, one thing I'd be happy to do, and again, this is like flashbacks because, when we first met in 2017, this was sort of like, this was a bit of the idea at the time. It was why I was invited by a few people to come and like, tell us what happened in Detroit to see if this is useful. I'm always happy to share these connections and contacts, not just me, but folks that, help set it up and run it and are more politically connected than I am, because I do think it wasn't designed to last forever in Detroit. Like the project lasted for like a couple of years, but what it really did do is we saw the outcomes as far as like that helped Detroit stand up its own data department, public data portal, more data sharing between parties. It almost got like the data sharing party going in a sense.
I think he also had a good CIO in Beth Nimblock.
She did, and she joined pretty much like during that. I think that was when Detroit was in its bankruptcy. And then there was, during the project, there was a new mayoral election. The current mayor was elected. And then he hired Beth, the new CIO, Garland Gilchrist, who's now the lieutenant governor of Michigan, just brought some people in that were, maybe had some influence from that survey project, kind of used some of the energy that was happening. And then to your point earlier, yeah.
The current lieutenant governor of Michigan was the CIO of the city?
Worked very closely with Beth. So he was not.
That's great. You got a techie up there at the.
We do. Garland, he's cool. He's a former neighbor in Courttown in our neighborhood in Detroit, and yeah, an interesting guy. But yeah, he came through the civic tech kind of like pedigree and experience. Worked at Microsoft. He worked on like the Obama campaign, I think, which was very digitally focused. It's funny because both a long time ago and not that long ago, but it was like, you can use digital tools to reach people. Now it's like, sounds passe, but yeah, so there were all these great people that worked, either on that survey or kind of like, right after it came in to stand up these digital services. And a part of that too, to your point earlier about like, I think there's a time for public-private partnerships, and there's a time to also bring it in the house of government and public ownership. And I do think Detroit did a pretty good job on that, because they made a decision pretty early on where it's like, you can't, there's a time and a place for a vendor, but then there's also like, we need to make sure that we know how to do this stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, we need to keep it going.
Yep.
Yeah, well, this gets, I don't know, that whole conversation does a lot of memories and thoughts there. And one thing I'll mention on this, because this may have relevancy on the property tax issue too. One of the things that kind of softly evolved out of the citywide blight survey was with the recognition that property tax debt and property tax foreclosure was a leading driver of blight. That was one of the discoveries that we had in Detroit. This kind of door-to-door approach evolved into a program called Neighbor to Neighbor. The domain for it now, it's foreclosureoutreach.org, but basically in Detroit and now a growing number of other cities, people get organized to visit homes that are late on their property taxes and offer information about programs that can be of assistance. So sometimes people will qualify as a homeowner occupant or a veteran, or a list of other statuses, and will also administer an optional survey. So like trying to figure out, like, if you want to answer, what's your relationship to the home? Are you a renter? Are you an owner? Are you a family member of a deceased former owner? And that has been an incredible program. We support that with our software and our mobile app. And that has really been illuminating, because rather than just knowing that all these things are behind in property taxes, they help people get out of that situation. And they also give a better understanding of like, what are the cases where people are behind? Like, how many are renters who are not responsible for property taxes, right? How many have a medical hardship or something else? And so I do think that I'm still very excited about these approaches that blend really good data with like the door-to-door work. You know what I mean? Sometimes I just don't think there's any other way to do it, because it's behind every point, a mass person, every point, right? And that's a data point that you don't have unless you have the interaction. So anyway, the work never ends, right?
No, that's a good thing.
Let's see, where are we in time? I know we've been going for a minute. I want to ask you guys, like, anything else that you want to chat about, or any other projects that you think are interesting that you want people to know about, or anything as we kind of start to conclude here?
I'm looking forward to the release of the energy data map that we're working on. So hopefully we'll have that out soon. And other than that, what Victor has pending to analyze with your data, that's something I'm looking forward to. We'll see where that takes us.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear, Victor, too, how that compares to the OSM approaches too. Just curious on like, vintage, and where one does a better job than the other, and just the advantages on that. Let's talk about that. Let me think. I don't know. Is there anything else I want to ask? I'm just really grateful for you guys' time. I mean, I know we covered, I don't know if we got into the deep history of Puerto Rico and like where, how the system kind of emerged. I mean, we did talk about Napoleonic law and some of these things. I don't know enough to get into the original like platting and the survey. I know that the properties are on the meets and bounds system. Sometimes in the States, you get this crazy kind of easy square mile, like, smaller and smaller subdivision. That is not the case on the island. You get some pretty funky shapes. And
oh yeah, absolutely. Well, we have a rough terrain, right? It's all hills and swamp. So Not only not only that, but a lot of some of these people have been sort of people who in the past in the agricultural society they lived as when sugarcane was king, which
Yeah.
was until around 1904 in around the 1940s, right? So most of the land was occupied by huge plantations, and people lived in somebody else's. Some people were allowed to live in the landlord's land, right? In the plantation land. And other people just lived in land, and this happens all over Latin America. People just settled in land that nobody else wanted, right? Which is um, hillsides, and swampy land, right? So you have eventually some of those properties became actual registered properties, but you're going to have funky shapes, right? Because it responds to certainly funky geometries, because it's it's not going to it's going to respond to that particular context.
And that's always a challenge. When I think of states that have challenges with either accurate parcel data or access to parcel data. I think about states like Kentucky, which first off is a meets and bounds state, so it's not really rectilinear. It was drawn to carve out a particular land use or a particular kind of organic claim. Also, some challenging terrain, and in the case of Kentucky, it has a history where the land had been promised to Revolutionary War soldiers
Mhm.
is sort of like a payment for their service. And then when people kind of showed up to claim their land, there were already people kind of there and squatting on it. And not, I don't mean, of course, indigenous people were everywhere in North and South America. And that's its own story of kind of, territorial carvings and conflict and all of it. But just other European settlers were already there. And it just created sort of a tremendous mess. And so there's always a story of where things are challenged, and that's the unique history of Puerto Rico and moving from plantation systems and different kinds of land carvings out, and then social mores of being okay, just kind of being in a place, and then trying to impose structure on top of it. All of that adds complexity, right? And I think what we're dealing with, what you're dealing with, we're all dealing with now is it feels like it should all be easier than it is, but there's this stack of human legacies written on top of each other, right? And and the work you do helps make that legible, but it's not straightforward.
Yep. There's an additional perhaps an additional angle that perhaps I wanted to mention. It's not just marginal land being settled, uh, but also, since the plantations had so much power over the land in the first half of the 20th century, the towns always remained very small, right? So when basically sugarcane farming stopped being the most important business in Puerto Rico, there was suddenly a lot of open sugarcane land to build, right? To build, and that coincided with the post-war era, which was federal money for highways, right? Which was automobile-oriented development. So automobile-oriented development does not, for let's say, it does not need a grid. So the central cores of the downtowns of the small towns in Puerto Rico, or the 78 municipalities of Puerto Rico, are more or less gridded, but they're tiny. They're like, most towns are like, eight, I don't know, man, 12 blocks, maybe 12 blocks, and that's it. And then just an enormous ocean of car-oriented development just basically swamped the entire surrounding area. So that's also going to result in funky geometries, because it does not respond to a need to needing a grid, because car-oriented development doesn't need a grid.
Not required. It can make it easier to get where you're going, but I hear you.
Well, it becomes, well, the sort of the design criteria changes because let's say a developer builds a car oriented suburb. What they're trying to do is to avoid through traffic, right?
Cul-de-sacs and
Yeah, they want to make streets that are basically private for the people that live inside their subdivision, to live inside that subdivision. That's how they make it, right? So technically the streets belong to the municipality. Municipality has to pave them, for example, every 20, 30 years, but they're made in a way where they're functionally private.
Can I ask you a question too before we departed here too, because this has been on the mind, and when I was doing some research and just like refreshing on like what are some of the interesting real estate and property quirks and challenges in Puerto Rico. One of the things that I saw pop up was zoning, and I'll tell you like zoning has been on the mind over here for a while because it's a fundamental part of land use. It creates commissions for what can and can't be built. I actually had a guest on the podcast a little bit ago. A guy named Nolan Gray wrote an amazing book. I highly recommend this book called Arbitrary Lines, and it's I think the subtitle is how zoning killed the American city and like how to change it. So it's very critical of zoning. He's a zoning expert. He was worked in the planning department of New York, had to like communicate the zoning code. He's been working in that world for many years at this point, and kind of walks through the history of zoning, which is not really as old as people might assume. It just crossed over like its 100th birthday, and its history was very it's tied up in sort of racist exclusionary desires. Sort of like, oh, you can't put this rental place in our community or this kind of business because it could attract like those people. Now people view it as like,
Mhm.
oh, it's a good thing to just kind of separate annoying land uses, but we had ways of separating true annoyances like previously. Anyway, I'll shut up about zoning other than I'm curious, like, is there a good zoning data set, or is zoning well understood in Puerto Rico, or is that I kind of read and heard that it was also rather mysterious, and it stands out to me as something that impacts development invisibly. And I haven't heard you guys discuss it yet, so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on zoning.
Yeah, there's recently the Puerto Rico is kind of idiosyncratic because urban planning grew out of municipal government practice historically, right? Uh, but in Puerto Rico, yeah, that may have also happened. But in the 1940s, we had an American governor called Rexford Tugwell. He's also famous because he was part of FDR's brain trust, and he's also famous because he was attacked and accused of being a pinko, of being perhaps sympathetic to socialism, to some aspects of socialist or planned or directed economy. And he created in the 1940s the Puerto Rico Planning Board. And I, what I've been told by my urban planning professors was that they stripped the planning faculties, the planning powers from the municipalities. Um, that may be true. I've yet to see it in the literature, but they stripped the municipalities and they intended to do everything by themselves, but in a single centralized planning board. And curiously enough, the Puerto Rico Planning Board was ESRI, as in ESRI. They were their first customer. So I
Interesting.
read somewhere. Yeah, and
Was Esri's first customer?
that's what I read somewhere. Actually,
Wow.
Fascinating.
I'd have to confirm it.
Yeah.
Confirm with somebody.
Government
that
should
knows
have
more about
taken
it.
the government should have taken a stake in Esri for that.
Yeah.
Jack does not accept investors or shareholders. I admire his independence, but so that would have been back in the. Oh, I should know this. I went to the Esri conference.
In the 70s, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say 60s or 70s because they just had an anniversary. I feel dumb for not remembering it. And I went to one of their sessions. They had a great session called The Last, or like GIS the first 100 years or something like that, and it was like
Mhm.
company history mixed with like, you know, uh, computer history that enables GIS, but also like some spatial mathematics and stuff. And but that is a wild anecdote. We'll take that with a grain of salt until we
Yeah.
learn that. But that's very interesting.
So part of the uses of urban planning is to kind of well, you find out where the swampy area is. It's going to get flooded. You find out areas where you shouldn't want to build because, for example, maybe it would affect your water source and all that sort of stuff. So you can designate places where it would be okay to build and places where it should be okay to build. And that's useful because once a developer wants to develop a property, they can see, oh no, well, you can develop here and you can't develop here, and that basically that stops the developer from wasting time trying to find out if his place is if his property is located in a place that's good for building or not. So planning is justified. Nevertheless, zoning, yeah, there's a problem with in the States right now, from what I've seen, especially in the housing crisis in California, is that municipalities have a very strong powers of zoning, so they could just basically they probably belong to a large metropolitan area, a municipality that belongs to part of a large metropolitan area, like let's say Los Angeles, one of the many cities, one of the many municipalities that are in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. Well, within their jurisdiction, they zone for single family housing, and maybe they have uh, public transit stations like train stations or subway stations within their jurisdictions, and still they prohibit building more dense zoning. And what seems to be happening in California is that they're passing laws in which the state can basically come in and say you can't zone for that, right? The situation in Puerto Rico was that the planning board was suddenly in the 1940s responsible for all the zoning in Puerto Rico, but they were never able to, they never had the capacity to do it, right? So Puerto Rico was mostly unzoned, or they zoned for this kind of default R0, which is a very rural kind of zoning was the default. And that all changed in 1991. The government finally recognized that having a centralized planning board to do all zoning in Puerto Rico, to do all urban planning, was not getting the results. Urban planning wasn't happening at the level that it should, and they basically delegated planning to the municipalities, and they gave the power back to the municipalities. And the municipalities, even though they had to jump through hoops, but they were able to get enough powers to designate their own zoning, right? But each municipality did it their own way, and the central government right now is unhappy with that situation because it seems, now this is just speculation, but I believe they want to streamline some particular projects, and they don't want to deal with that. It's streamlined, and they don't want to deal with the diversity in the zoning across all the 78 municipalities. So they're unhappy with the current situation and trying to sort of standardize the district, the rules,
The permit law,
Yeah.
the permit and zoning law right now here in Puerto Rico, Jerry, is at its worst point ever in the history of Puerto Rico. It's been the reglamento. How do you say that in English, Victor?
The regulation.
The rules or regulations drafted after the new law that was passed has been declared null 3 times by the court. They took it to the appeals and they lost, and to the highest court. And basically, nobody knows what the rule is right now.
So I'll give some context, right? So this is related to what this is related to what I said, that the central government is unhappy with the diversity of the zoning, the diversity of zoning within the 78 municipalities. So they came up with a new regulation that's supposed to standardize the zoning districts, so that you're going to have the same zoning districts definitions in all municipalities, and municipalities would be responsible for. This is how I understand it. Would be responsible of drawing the districts, right? They were going to draw the polygons, the geometries of these districts, but the district definitions belong to the central government. So it's basically kind of pulling back or clawing back the powers that were given to the municipalities in 1991. So they tried to do this, and they've tried to do this is the third time they tried to do it, and it's been declared null for the third time by the Supreme Court of Puerto Rico. So I'm sure they're going to come back at it again. And I have mixed feelings about the situation. And I mixed feelings in the sense that centralizing zoning definitions perhaps could be thought of as anti-democratic, because municipalities design their zoning according to their needs, and you're saying no, that's not valid. That's what the central government wants.
Yeah.
But at the same time, seeing the example of what's happening in many parts of the U.S., where local municipalities, they do single-family zoning in places that should be densified, and it exacerbates the housing crisis. Well, obviously, there should be some sort of there should be some limits into what municipalities can do in terms of urban planning within their jurisdiction, because it affects everybody else. So with that mixed feeling, I go around with one example: that centralized regulation, which defines the districts that are available for municipalities to implement. It includes parking minimums. Like, for example, in order to build, you have to offer X amount of parking space in order to build housing, for example, or to have businesses. And I completely disagree with that, with having parking minimums, because it makes for poor land use. It makes everything obligatorily car-oriented or unnecessarily car-oriented. Well, and I disagree with those stipulations. And what they're going to do is they're going to take away municipalities' ability to not have parking requirements in their zoning.
Victor, I will send a couple of links after this. I think you'll enjoy Nolan's book. And there's a zoning project. We spoke with the team fairly recently called the National Zoning Atlas, which is a program out of Cornell where they're endeavoring to research and compare all zoning codes across the 30,000 some crazy number of local municipalities in the US that I think you would find interesting. And I know that they would be interested in interfacing with Puerto Rico somehow. May or may not be appropriate, but a dot to connect there. And I do want to wrap up and let you guys go and say thank you again for I feel like we're just getting started again, actually, but now it's been like 2 hours. So I feel like we should wrap on this. Giancarlo, I got a weird moment of zen as we close out here. As I was falling asleep last night and I was thinking about this conversation and some stuff to talk with you about, I had like a memory where I'm like, is this real? Did I visit Giancarlo's house and watch his cat slam dunk a basketball or at least like score a basket? Is that a thing that actually happened? I remember, like, doesn't your cat do like a trick where he goes up high and like drops the ball?
He fetches teeth.
Okay.
It's a set of plastic teeth, and he would take them and then like alley-oop the teeth, smack them down, or catch them with his mouth. Yeah, I have a video. There's a video of this on YouTube.
Okay, it was such like a delightful thing, but I was thinking, I was like, I don't remember this perfectly, and maybe I'm almost dreaming right now. Maybe I just dreamt this. So I did see your cat score a basket with not a ball, but some teeth. Okay.
Yeah, he fetches. Very funny cat. He's alive and well.
Good. All right. So on that note,
too fat and old to fetch anymore, though.
Okay. Well, maybe we've got a few more hoops in them yet, but I really appreciate you guys. We'll continue to point people your way whenever questions about real estate, data, how to connect in Puerto Rico appear, and just admire both of your work. And I look forward to continuing our relationship and to figuring out what else we can do together over time. And you've always got a friend and connector here. So
Jerry, thank you so much for your time. Always interested in our conversations and collaborating and working together.
great. Well, to be continued then. You guys have a great weekend, okay?
Hey, thank you, Jerry.
These guys, thanks, Victor. Thanks,
Nice to
Giancarlo.
meet you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.